social ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Friday after Christmas, and again, as many of you might have wondered, are we going to do a live program today? Yes, it's a live program today. Tuned into a talk show this morning, and they were playing Christmas music because I don't know that he wanted to come in day after Christmas, but I've been able to talk a few people into coming in, and we certainly would love to hear from you as well. Liberty McArtor, of course, is the co-host of Point of View and also the host of the Know Why podcast, and you are here. Hope you had a great Christmas.
I did. It's great to be here too, Kerby.
And again, Dr. Merrill Matthews, you're going to be with me every Friday here for a while. So again, it's always great to have you here. And we've got one of your articles from the Hill.
You're stuck with me at least for next Friday. And who knows, maybe we'll sing Christmas carols before the show's over.
I think so. We got all sorts of fun things to talk about. But let me start with one that I did not put on the calendar, but came yesterday during Christmas Day. And that is numerous U.S. forces struck Islamic targets in Nigeria on Christmas Day. And this was in retaliation for basically the fact that if you look at the numbers that we've talked about with our friends from Open Doors, about 70% of all the Christians killed worldwide have been killed in Nigeria. So this has been perhaps the worst place to be a Christian right now. And so after a lot of talking and warning, President Trump did issue targets in northwestern part of Nigeria, and that's in retaliation for the years of attacks on Christian civilians there. I might just mention those come in addition to about 20 different attacks in Syria of ISIS targets, about 100 different bombing attacks in Somalia, but this one is a little bit different, and it is something we may talk about on Monday if this story develops any further, because we've had individuals that have been on the ground there in Nigeria telling us that story, and it has been, Dr. Merrill Matthews, an underreported story, as illustrated by the fact that even, interestingly enough, Bill Maher said, if you're listening to and don't know about this, listening to the news that you're getting isn't very good.
Yes, indeed. Well, it sounds like they hit about 70 targets, they're saying, using jet aircraft, helicopters, and artillery on this. And we understand that there are fatalities, but we don't know, as far as I've seen, we don't know the number of fatalities yet. And, of course, they have been attacking Christians. They've also been attacking some of the jihadist groups will attack Muslims as well. And so you've got Nigeria is basically sort of the two major religions, Christianity and Islam. But these have been a pain for a long time, and something needed to be done. And fortunately, unlike Venezuela, President Trump got the approval of the head of Nigeria to go in there. So we're doing this in some coordination. I understand that even some Jordan aircraft was there as well. So that looks like a good effort to try to get some more people in there to address this problem.
Again, if you wonder, 3,100 Christians killed. That's sort of the official number. And as I said, according to our friends at Open Doors, which we have on with some regularity, 70% of all the Christians killed around the world have been killed in Nigeria.
Yeah, I mean, and this has been going on for a long time, according to National Review since 2009, 19,000 churches have been destroyed as well. So speaking of pop culture references, I think the younger generation may have learned about this issue not from the news, but from rapper Nicki Minaj, who has actually been pleading the case of Nigerian Christians, which is welcome. So, yes, I'm glad to see action on this.
So you got Nicki Minaj and you got Bill Maher and a few others. So it's a story unto itself. Well, we are coming, of course, to the end of our fiscal year. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but I hope that as you go to the website, you're going to find a number of articles. And the first one I thought we might talk about that is kind of a year in review, and that is what Byron York called Trump's most important achievement. Estimates are somewhere around the idea of 9 million migrants crossed illegally into the United States under the Biden administration. And now you've had the deportation. And again, if nothing else, that's a very important issue. If nothing else, Liberty, that we've been talking about here on Point of View and even done articles in Outlook about.
Yes, and just coming off of the Next Generation Roundtable, which I hosted on Tuesday, I was looking at some statistics among right-leaning younger voters, and this really is the number one issue. They see it as Trump's biggest accomplishment, and they want to see more deportations of illegal immigrants, which is actually, pretty popular just across the board with American voters in general.
It just isn't popular with some of the groups that are out there attacking ICE right now.
Right. He's been very aggressive and successful in deporting. The numbers are coming out from Department of Homeland Security. And I just have to say, for me, since Trump oftentimes exaggerates numbers a little bit, because they're talking about 2.5 million, 600,000 that have been voluntarily, I think, taken the money to $1,000. I understand yesterday or day before yesterday, Secretary Noem said it's now $3,000 if you'll self-deport. So I'm thinking about it myself. but I went to try to find if there's any way you can sort of corroborate the numbers. It's been a lot. I'm just always a little skeptical with Trump's numbers, as you've often pointed out. If he would just say this is one of the most as opposed to the most, but it's a big number. We know it's a big number because so many people have been taken from the country. Some
of the people like to write the numbers down, and we'll give those real quickly because they said 605,000 deportations, and ultimately the exit of about 2.5 million. You say, well, how does that? Well, the idea is about 1.9 million self-deported. Mm-hmm. Now, let me just emphasize the fact that I posted this piece by Byron York, where he gives the numbers from Department of Homeland Security. I thought of posting an article that was in The Guardian in which the person actually was arguing that this president hasn't deported as many as he says he has, and that if you carry that out and do a comparison, Joe Biden deported more people than Donald Trump. I had trouble believing that one, too. But nevertheless, somewhere within this range, certainly a fair amount of deportation has taken place, and a lot more has been people self-deporting.
Even if Biden deported more, the net immigration was much higher.
Yes. I know. When I saw that figure, I said, that doesn't even make sense. That didn't even pass the straight face test. But these are the kinds of things we struggle with when we try to give some numbers. But the numbers that I've heard other people mention are the fact that there were probably about 2 million people that self-deported. Because I mentioned that a couple of months ago when somebody was saying, these don't add up. Well, that's because you have to think about the actual people that were put into a truck or a plane or whatever and deported. And then you have to look at the number of people who, as best as we can determine, voluntarily deported and will continue to do so. So nevertheless, this is the first article. I thought it would be kind of interesting for you to follow because, if nothing else, that is kind of one of the big issues, as Liberty mentioned. Also, at Turning Point, when they asked him what the top issues were, and the other ones on the top issue was the issue of radical Islam. And so I thought somewhere along the line we'll get back to that one as well. But when we come back from the break, very good piece by Dr. Merrill Matthews. What does it mean to be a principled conservative? And you might say, well, why should I care? Because the next article is talking about the rather significant exodus from the Heritage Foundation, which has always been seen as a conservative think tank. Matter of fact, some of the people leaving the Heritage Foundation are the people we have been interviewing for years. So that tells you a great deal. So we have really a lot to cover today, and we will certainly get into that a little bit later. Some other pieces on everything from the role of religion in political life to free speech, as well as the Know Why podcast and even Penn and Extra's commentary. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, it is estimated that Charles Wesley wrote over 6,500 hymns. Perhaps his best-known hymn is Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Over the years, it has been edited slightly, but the meaning and theology remains as he wrote it more than 2 centuries ago. It begins with a proclamation of the birth of Jesus. Hark the herald angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. The hymn reminds us why Christ came to earth. Jesus came into the world to bring peace, but many who sing this song fail to realize that it was to bring peace between us and God. Wesley's hymn reminds us that his birth was so that God and sinners could be reconciled. We are the sinners in this hymn, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have broken God's commandments and need to be reconciled with God. This was done when Christ died for our sins. This hymn by Charles Wesley goes on to describe who Jesus Christ is. Christ by highest heaven adored, Christ the everlasting Lord. Late in time behold him come, offspring of the Virgin's womb. Veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. Pleased as man with men to dwell, Jesus our Emmanuel. This is the wonder of the incarnation. Jesus became the offspring of the Virgin's womb. God became man and was veiled in flesh, even though he was the incarnate deity. This Christmas week, let us all once again reflect upon the incarnation. How wonderful yet mysterious that God would become man and dwell among us, and that he would be willing to die on a cross for our sins. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on chemical abortion, go to viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. Viewpoints.info/chemical abortion. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again in the studio with us today, Dr. Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor, and let me just mention that we're going to focus on our second article, and it is from The Hill, and it's written by Merrill Matthews. Are you a principled conservative? And I think it's important to illustrate that because our next one has to do with the Heritage Foundation and a variety of other things, and what it means to be a conservative, the Turning Point rally the other day, and what it means to be a conservative if you're following Tucker Carlson, and what it means to be a conservative for following Candace Owens. So in some respects, I will put the mantle of Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley, on you at the moment, because years ago, we're old enough to remember, when he had to really define what it meant to be a Republican, what it meant to be a conservative, who's in the party, who's out of the party, and who's in the movement, who's out of the movement. That's something that we haven't done in a long time.
Yeah, he set the mantle back in about 1960 when 100 young conservatives met at his house in Sharon, Connecticut, and they drafted a statement of 12 principles called the Sharon Statement.
Right. And
that became sort of the the guide for what Republicans and conservatives believe. And of course, there's some other groups now, one called Principles First, and then there's another one called Freedom Conservatives, who have adopted, they've got their own set of principles, which are very similar to the Sharon. I mean, they may add one thing more, adjust it a little bit, but they're very, very similar. And so what they're trying to do is to say, this is the principles that conservatives have held to for some time. And the reason they're doing that is because we're seeing so many people who claim to be conservatives sort of taking different positions. So if you're a conservative and you believe in the Constitution, then there's times when you say, well, I'd like to be able to do this or that, but the Constitution doesn't give me the power to do that. And yet we see the Trump administration is challenging a number of things in the Constitution. The Supreme Court has sided with him on many cases. I suspect it'll side against him on many cases as well. But he's challenging some of that. Free enterprise. It has been typically, conservatives have said, government shouldn't be involved in business, shouldn't be bailing out business, shouldn't be trying to tell business what to do and so forth. And the Trump administration has gotten heavily involved in a number of businesses, for better or worse. It may work out to be for better. Maybe it works out well, but it goes against some major principles, just that we sort of feel like you should sort of stay in these guidelines. And the third thing I'll mention is fiscal responsibility. And I can clearly say there are no Republicans or Democrats who are fiscally responsible and haven't been for some time. And, sometimes you get stuck. I'm sure there are a number of conservatives who did not want to vote for the budget that passed here just recently. Right. But you get to the point where you say, we're spending too much money, we can't do this. But then you get the choice of either you vote for this, which spends way too much money, or the government shuts down, and you're in a terrible position as a member of Congress. What do? You don't want the government shutting down. You don't want to vote for this extra money. But that's oftentimes what they're faced with.
Well, again, for people that don't have the article, I would highly recommend it because, first of all, you talk about this idea of faithful adherence to the U.S. Constitution, and liberals and progressives talk about a living Constitution.
Yes, they do.
And certainly we have 3 justices on the Supreme Court that pretty much hold to that idea. And then you have a few others, and it kind of varies on how you want to count, whether you want to count 2, 3. I don't know that you're going to count more than about 3, but you could say 6 at least aren't saying that they believe in that. But then when you have all sorts of questions about who can impose taxes, who can levy tariffs and those kinds of things, that's the first one. The second one, of fiscal responsibility, as you have jokingly said so many times before, Democrats don't have any problem with that. Republicans say they have a problem with it and then vote with it anyway.
Yeah.
And
then they claim to feel bad about it after they vote.
Feel very bad about it, but they still vote for it anyway. And then the issue of free enterprise, because let's face it, you've had Republican presidents like George W. Bush, the famous line that Kelly Shackelford used to quote all the time, I decided to violate the principles of free enterprise to save free enterprise. Right. And then, of course, whether it's Barack Obama and a variety of others bailing out all these different companies. And, of course, as you point out, this is a punchline I'd like to get your thoughts on. All of this raises the issue of hypocrisy. The time is coming, perhaps as soon as 2029, when a Democrat will be in the White House again. That person will almost surely follow Trump's lead in expanding the role of government and business, doling out taxpayer money, imposing tariffs or taxes at will, and ignoring constitutional restraints, and do it all by bypassing Congress. And then conservatives will certainly denounce that, but they should be denouncing it right now, don't you think?
They should, yes. If you're going to stay principled, and sometimes you say, I understand you've got a really tough choice, you have to make a decision here, but there's just almost nobody speaking out against these things. And what's worse, a number of the people who I know who are conservatives, or at least historically have been conservatives, will go out and praise some of the things that we would think, that's really gone over the line a good bit from what a conservative principle could be. I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago of state legislators, and there was 2 well-known economists talking about. One of them was complaining about the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that had he says he felt like they caused the depression. Now some will say they exacerbated the depression. He felt they caused the depression, but at any rate, he said nothing about the Trump tariffs. And I don't know how he went on and on about all the problems that the tariffs caused in Smoot-Hawley, but said not a word about the Trump tariffs. And I find that, in fact, went on to say he thought Donald Trump was the closest thing to Ronald Reagan we've had since Ronald Reagan. And I thought that just doesn't sound right to me.
And part of the reason I wanted to bring this up, because, again, we're the 2 old guys around the table, and Liberty's listening in, and many others are listening in. If you have only heard about Ronald Reagan and didn't live during that time, you can see why that would make some sense, because after all, he's standing up for very important principles. But I can't even think of Ronald Reagan instituting tariffs. And back then, fiscal responsibility was he lamented that we had can you believe it? A $1 trillion national debt.
Ronald Reagan, and this became an issue just about a month ago when Canada ran an ad citing Ronald Reagan, who in 1987 decided to impose a tariff on Japan. And he said in the presentation, they said, I am loath to do this. This is not something I want to do, but Japan has broken an agreement with us on something called semiconductors, or computer chips, I think it was. And so he said, I'm going to impose this temporarily, and we'll see if we can't get. So So he made his case for he did do tariffs, but it was something that he did not want to do, felt compelled to do, and only did it for a temporary time. And that's something that Congress has given the president the power to do. We'll see if the Supreme Court says that Trump's expansion of that is going to be legal.
After the break, we're going to get into the Heritage Foundation, because part of this is what principles do you hold to? The other is, as you have pointed out, I think you're the one that the first time anybody said something maybe disparaging about Candace Owens was a piece that she wrote about. And now we have Nick Fuentes, we have Tucker Carlson, we have all sorts of other issues, which I think illustrate this point. So this is our second article, which really sets us up for all the conversation we're going to have about the Heritage Foundation. But Liberty, I thought for just a few minutes as we come to a break, I might just point out that a email that I just sent out says that the days of 2025 are dwindling down. We don't want people to miss the opportunity to have their gift doubled, because if they go to the website right now, it still shows that we have $155,000 for a matching challenge. Well, let me update it. I just got the news a few minutes ago. We've had so much gift coming in that we're down to 119,000, which is still pretty significant. I mean, really, if we started out with 119,000, we think we're doing pretty well, but we've actually been able to make a very significant amount of headway into that, which is all the more reason why I thought we'd talk about it today, because I do know that a lot of our listeners like to wait till Wednesday night. Usually that's a little bit late, but if you're one that want to give January 30th or 31st, fine. But I think there's some real wisdom right now. If you wanted to support Point of View, we have match money on the table. It's a dollar for dollar match. And why would people want to support Point of View?
Yes, well, you have to give by the end of December to have your gift doubled, so remember that. But just even in this conversation about principled conservatism, I grew up listening to Point of View, so I don't personally remember Ronald Reagan, but I do feel like I got a really good education on a biblical worldview applied to political issues and cultural issues, and kind of it helped me understand what those conservative principles mean. And it's interesting talking with young people today. They don't really remember politics pre-Trump. And so I think that this is the time when we do need to educate people about those principles. And that's something that Point of View has been doing for over 50 years. And it influences people. And I would say contribute to that. Join the movement.
I agree completely. It's interesting that people around sort of think Trump is normal, and it's not normal historically. For better or worse, it's not normal historically. Things tended to be a little quieter and a little more congenial in Washington.
Yes. But again, one of the things I wanted to encourage you to do is as we go to a break, there is an opportunity for you to click on that banner that says Give Now. Of course, at any point, you can certainly call our order line number. That's 800-347-5151. And I know some of you wait to the last moment because you want to put us over the top, but I thought I'd also let you know that we're now down to 119,000. So we've made some significant headway. Was that about $36,000 that's come in? And that's great. So time for you to respond. We'll be right back.
When you support Point of View, you are joining a coalition of listeners around the nation who are passionate about restoring America's godly heritage, re-anchoring her in biblical truth. There is no better time to support Point of View than right now. The days of 2025, they are dwindling down, and so are the matching funds available to you. When you give by December 31st, your gift will be doubled, 2 times the impact. But that time is running out, and your support of Point of View is critical to ensure that Americans everywhere have access to biblically based resources on air, online, and in print. Do not wait. Join the movement, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. Give by December 31st to have your gift doubled. Give at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. What does it mean to be a conservative or a Republican? Really, how do Christians interact with the public policy arena? These are issues we talk about, and this one is in some respects a puzzler, because let's at least set the table by the fact that the Heritage Foundation is an organization we've worked with for years. Ed Fulner, who was the head of that, was so nice to allow us occasionally, when I would go to Washington, D.C., back before we had all this fancy equipment, I would sit in the Heritage Foundation booth and we would broadcast Point of View live from Washington, D.C., and that was great. And we had all sorts of friends that were there over the years, and then others that came to work there, like, as a matter of fact, some people that now are leaving, Steve Moore and Hans von Spakowski. These are names you've heard because we've talked with them. And nevertheless, the Heritage Foundation now is headed up by Kevin Roberts. You've heard us talk about some of that, Tucker Carlson and the rest. But if nothing else, this has been a conservative think tank funded by a lot of people that were Christians as well as secular conservatives. And it has been a very significant think tank in Washington, D.C., and when you have some of these individuals who we have interviewed for years, and Dr. Matthews, you've sat in this chair, you've interviewed some of these same people for years that are now jumping ship, you're kind of saying, what's happening?
Yeah, it's just amazing the long history the Heritage Foundation has. I think Fulner started in 1974, if I remember right. And back in the late 70s, I got on their mailing list, and I'd get stuff almost every day as they were sending out public policy papers.
Yes.
It was something they did, and Heritage became sort of kind of the umbrella think tank for other think tanks. They were willing to help other think tanks, especially state-based think tanks, establish themselves, figure out how to raise funds and do other things. And so many of the people there were just leading scholars in healthcare, welfare, foreign policy, economic policy, and other things. And so it has taken a turn. And this goes back. It didn't start with Kevin Roberts. It got started earlier.
Oh, sure.
But they've taken a turn to being much more aggressive and active in ways that and no longer a basic think tank. And Heritage, I think, was the first conservative think tank. Before that, you had the Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute, and they tended to be on the liberal side. Right. Heritage started to try to do free market and so forth. So it was a major player, but it has changed its role now. I don't really see much in the way of policy papers anymore from them. They seem to be doing more just political activism. And then, of course, we had the issue with Kevin Roberts and Tucker Carlson, and that apparently was sort of the nail in the coffin, driving a number of people. I think right now it's 13, 15 people have decided to leave, and they're going over to Mike Pence's groups, Americans Advancing Prosperity,
Advancing American Freedom.
Advancing American Freedom.
Yeah,
and they've made the case that we didn't poach these guys; they came to us. It wasn't them going around trying to pull those away. I'm sure there were some talks going on behind, because I suspect many of the Heritage people were uncomfortable for a while in the kind of place they've been put in.
Well, again, this article says some 15 or more Heritage employees. And again, some of these people might not be people that you know, but if you have been listening to us talk about, for example, voter integrity, Hans von Spakowski certainly
gold standard.
Yes, kind of the standard there. He is left. Another one who we've interviewed over the years, Stephen Moore. You've interviewed him. I've interviewed him, and he's become a Trump economic advisor, but he resigned. And some of them are resigning with a heavy heart and a profound sadness. And to me, that's the sadness, because whenever I see individuals in the same foxhole shooting each other, there's something seriously wrong with that.
Yeah, I think this is really illustrates the broader discussion or divide that's happening on the right. And, you've mentioned America Fest a couple of times. We definitely talked about it on Tuesday with the roundtable. But just, is the conservative movement going to stick to those principles that you were talking about, in the last segment, that have long guided the conservative movement? And then there's another branch that is moving more toward populism. And one of the things you said in your article that I thought was so good was that, the the liberal side has tended to be more goal-oriented versus the conservative side more principled. And I think we're seeing a lot of people on the right becoming more goal-oriented. And even Trump has said, we're going to have so much winning, you're going to get tired of winning. But I think that a lot of people have adopted that because they have felt disenfranchised by the left and they want victories as well. But when that's the only thing you're focused on, then a lot of times you forget that sometimes you do have to conserve and not advance as much. And I think that that's really the battle that we're seeing.
And this gets back to what's the basis of conservatism. So conservatives tend to go with principles, and it's not just in sort of our political. We do with the Constitution. What does the Constitution say? If the Constitution says something and it's clear, that's it. If the Bible says something and it's clear, that's it. So conservatives tend to sort of look for those principles and try to be guided by the principles. Sometimes you get into a conflict where you've got two major principles and you're not sure which one sort of weighs heaviest there. But liberals, by and large, are goal-oriented. They are not principled. They have end. They want to get to universal basic health coverage and health insurance. They want to get universal basic income. They want to get unionized workforces and so forth. And that's their goal. And if they can bend any principles or accept any principles, whatever it takes to get to those goals is what they typically do.
Sometimes you learn where a person stands by what they don't talk about. And it seems to me that, for example, the Heritage Foundation could be talking about the fact that we certainly have a lot of people with a living constitution. And I'll give credit to some of the people that have been in the Edward Meese Center for Law and Judicial Studies have mentioned that a little bit, but not as much, especially when it came to things like tariffs. Then you talked about fiscal responsibility. When's the last time you've seen a policy paper from any of these, quote, conservative think tanks talking about the fact that we are spending our children and grandchildren's future inheritance? And so when you're not talking about that, those are issues. When you didn't mention in conservatism, which we're going to cover later on with Victor Davis Hanson, open season on Jews. Within the conservative movement, Liberty, you and I have talked about this before, you're starting to see the Nick Fuentes and others openly anti-Jewish, yet having the mantle of being a conservative.
And I think the problem is even people who maybe wouldn't agree with that, they are so afraid of losing votes or of not maintaining the big tent coalition that Trump was able to raise, that they are hesitant to call that out. And what we're seeing a lot of is attacking of straw men. Well, we don't want to cancel and deplatform. That's what the left does. Nobody's saying cancel somebody, but you could free speech. It's like, well, respond with better speech. Call out the bad idea. You're allowed to criticize. That's part of the free speech game. But instead, anybody who does that is, again, by some people, accused of being against free speech or trying to cancel or deplatform. And the principled conservatives are saying, why don't you just condemn anti-Semitism? It's not that hard.
It's not that hard. And that's a Kevin Roberts issue, isn't it? Because he was trying to defend Tucker Carlson, who had Nick Fuentes on and never really pushed back.
Right.
And in some respects, you can say, look, we have a big enough tent that we will certainly allow people within the tent, but we don't have to necessarily agree with them or not sometimes call them out to show them a better way than what they're articulating at the time.
And, within the conservative principles, sometimes somebody's going to vote a way that you didn't approve of. Yeah. And you say, but, if you and I agree on 80% of things, we're colleagues. We're not, we're comrades. We're not enemies. But that's the issue. Tucker Carlson has the ability to be able to push back and raise important points when talking to somebody, interviewing somebody. He didn't do it. He didn't do it with Putin either. Yeah. When he interviewed Putin, it was a softball interview that allowed Putin to just sort of express all his thoughts without any pushback at all. And that's the real issue there. If you want to take somebody and talk about a controversial person, then you ought to also press some of the issues.
And so, again, I'd love to hear from some of you. We will open up the phones, 1-800-351-1212, because in some respects, as we'll even later when we get to the piece by Victor Davis Hanson, said, anti-Semitism used to be pretty much on the left. And as a matter of fact, there have been some books written about how to fight anti-Semitism, and the sections on the left are pretty pretty long, and the section on the right was pretty small. Matter of fact, going back to Proud Boys and a few groups like that, well, I'm afraid if they put an addended one or something like that, or an updated one, you're going to see a lot more in that regard. So that's just another one of those, I think, very important issues. So again, we thought these two papers, although written by different individuals, the first one written, of course, by Merrill Matthews on what it means to be a principled conservative, and certainly how we as Christians would think it's important for us to have the right interpretation of the Constitution, certainly fiscal responsibility, as well as the idea of a free market and free speech, which we'll get into more in just a few minutes. Those are important principles, and in some respects, we certainly then are seen, 15 or more is what the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal refers to it, and some of those names may not mean anything to you, but if you've been listening to Point of View, some of those names, certainly like Stephen Moore and Hans von Spakovsky and others, are people we've interviewed, and always hate to see an intramural fight, but that's why we stand up for principles. So we'll come back and talk about that and take some of your phone calls right after this.
New research on the gender divide shows that young men want marriage and family more than young women do. The Daily Signal reports that as recently as 1993, 83% of 12th grade girls told researchers they were likely to get married, while only 76% of boys that age thought they would tie the knot. Two recent surveys reveal that the status quo has flipped. A November Pew Research study shows 74% of 12th grade boys say they'll marry. Just 6 in 10 girls say they will do so. In September, NBC News asked 18 to 29-year-olds what factors they see as necessary for a successful life. Men rank getting married and having children higher than their female peers. The Daily Signal's Katrina Trinko detects a true values shift where women no longer see marriage and children as key to a fulfilling life. Political science Samuel Abrams and demographer Joel Kotkin analyzed the data on this phenomenon. In an article for Real Clear Investigations, they conclude that men and women increasingly inhabit separate psychological, relational, and civic universes that interpret adulthood, authority, intimacy, and obligation in profoundly different ways. They point to the steady decline of marriage and childbearing as a visible and devastating sign of this divide. Its result has been the disruption of the traditional paradigm, which emphasized family and community. They lament what they call a post-familial ethos. This change has been building since the 70s, the me decade. One factor is technology, which has made us more isolated from one another. Identity is derived less from ties to family. Instead, the self is primary. Dr. Abrams and Kotkin unpack this rewiring in detail. A key observation is that commitment now competes with autonomy, and autonomy often wins. This important article suggests creating a new family ethic, emphasizing ways to reinvigorate marriage and family formation. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, Liberty McArtor, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to Arizona first. Billy, thank you for calling in today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for picking up.
What would you like to add to our conversation?
I just wanted to thank you guys for taking a principled stance on, some pretty important issues there. I'm socially liberal, but fiscally conservative. And, I vote Democratic usually, but I still care and have compassion for my Republican and conservative brothers and sisters. And I've been concerned for them recently. I've seen a lot of people using the wrong tools to do the right job, and a lot of people using the right tools to do the wrong job. And it's nice and refreshing to see some light still in the party, because I love you guys. You're important.
Well, appreciate you calling. You keep listening, and we'll see what we can do to change your views or reinforce them. But, I was just thinking about this. Dr. Matthews, as the two old guys around the table during the break, we were talking about how it used to be that you would see people, both Republicans and Democrats, working together and oftentimes trying to find a solution. Mm-hmm. And whether it's Ronald Reagan and, of course, the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, you were using another example, which we can use as well. They just seemed to me to be a little of that. And then what was so interesting is Liberty piped in and said, well, yeah, but if you think about Ben Sasse, and we're all very sad to hear about where Ben Sasse is, he would oftentimes go out and have pizza with some of the people, but the divisions between Republicans and Democrats are greater than I've ever seen them. Mm-hmm. But the divisions right now within the Republican Party are almost as great as I've ever seen them.
It's interesting because in years past, back in the 90s, you had liberal Republicans and you had conservative Democrats. And over time, that sort of shifted so that if you're a conservative, you're going to be on the Republican side. If you're a liberal, you're going to be on the Democratic side. And there's not many in between there these days. And so I would argue that in years past, they had bipartisanship, but it was because you had either liberal Republicans voting with Democrats or conservative Democrats voting with Republicans. Now you have it's become so divided that it's just very hard to seems like to get anything done these days, and not just divided, but angry with people criticizing others extremely. You just doesn't have the decorum that you used to have when you were working with somebody who you disagreed with politically, but you still kept a sort of air of respectability.
I think so. Liberty, let me come to you because you've been, of course, doing the Know Why podcast, but you also were sitting in this chair the other day when we did the Next Generation Roundtable, and you've noticed that especially the Gen Z who've only grown up with Trump, they think that's the only way to respond. And I've oftentimes said, be careful of a person who only has a hammer in their toolbox because they'll treat everybody else like a nail. And it does seem to me that that's part of the problem. We need a little more generational perspective and recognize that things were a little more congenial in Congress not so long ago.
Yeah, I remember when I was writing about kind of the political issues right around the time that President Donald Trump was getting elected the first time. And I remember seeing a poll then that, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think they've only gotten worse, where significant proportions of both Democrats and Republicans viewed each other as absolutely evil and the enemy. And so I think what you've seen just within my lifetime for sure, and I'm sure with roots farther back, is a divergent understanding of what America even is. And now we're seeing that on the right too. Are you, is American based on creed or is it based on ethnic heritage? And so that debate is playing out. But if you are younger than me, even if you are Gen Z, that is the only atmosphere in which you've grown up. And so I think what needs to happen is understanding the frustrations, like it really is, and we've talked about this on Point of View, it's hard for a lot of young Americans. They feel like the American dream is out of reach. They feel like they can't buy a home. Fertility rate is falling. I think Charlie Kirk was really good at addressing those issues that young Americans are dealing with. But at the same time, going back to a lot of these principles that we've been talking about are actually some of the best ways to foster the kind of future that those young Americans are pining for. And so I think there needs to be some education of, an experience of a generation, but also education on the older part of, hey, look, these are some good ideas. Maybe we should consider them.
And, one of the things that's interesting, because we're talking about this split in Republicans, but you also have something going on in Democrats as the progressives are sort of gaining ground with a lot of energy behind that. Yeah. And, it's interesting because there are going to be, there's a certain percentage, I don't know what the percentage is, but a certain percentage of Democrats are going to be sort of traditional Democrats not wanting to go that far. And there's a certain number of Republicans who are going to be sort of traditional Republicans not wanting to go that far. And so instead of having two parties parties. You might almost have 4 parties.
I was thinking that.
With that, with 2 of them with R's and 2 of them with D's behind their name. And I'm not sure how this all plays out as we go forward.
Well, that's one of the things we'll be following and try to deal with. But let me take another phone call real quickly. In South Carolina, Laura, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, thank you. Really appreciate you guys taking my call.
Well, what would you like to add to our conversation?
Well, I just want to thank you because I listen to both conservative and liberal broadcasts, and this is one of the most balanced discussions I've heard. I think you're doing a lot of good work to end the division within parties and between Democrats and Republicans because like one of the people on your panel pointed out, we didn't used to, we might have divergent views, but we didn't view each other as evil. And I, have nostalgia for the days when the kind of unity we had during 9/11. I appreciate you talking about principles and the Constitution and following the letter of the law, paying attention to biblical principles.
Well, I do appreciate you calling in, and you keep listening as well, because that's one of the things that we are really dedicated to doing. Liberty, just before we take a break, again, I've been encouraging people to support Point of View, and of course the banner says Restoring America's Godly Heritage, because that's another thing we're going to be working on in 2026, and we're not the only ones, but we have produced a number of booklets and books and outlook material and all the sorts of other resources that people can have advantage of, and that's one of the reasons why people should support Point of View.
Yeah, we're coming up on America's 250th anniversary, so it's a great time to really talk about what does it mean to be an American? What is America? And Point of View has been talking about America's godly heritage and educating people on that for so many years. And I think, like the last caller demonstrates, people really are pining for less of this division. They want to be well informed. And I think a lot of people are seeing through just kind of the rise of the influencer media, or the media that is not truly biased or not truly balanced, but they're biased toward one thing or the other, and so everything they say is filtered through that. And so if you appreciate Point of View and you appreciate the balance, like the last caller, then realize this is Point of View's MO. I grew up listening to Point of View, and so it's something that I think Americans really need and they're really wanting more of.
Again, we have a matching challenge, $155,000, which is down to $119,000. So if you would want to support us, and I hope that you would, this particular gift can be given in a number of different ways. First of all, you can click on the button that says Give Now, and there's a couple of ways in which you can participate. A single gift, if you wanted to give $100, that becomes $200. A gift of $250 becomes $500. You can click another button that says Ongoing, and one of the things we've encouraged many of you to consider is to support us on a monthly basis. For as little as $1 a day or $30 a month, $360 a year or more, you receive not only the Outlook magazine, but also the booklets, and some of those that we have been talking about today are certain ones that we will be and have been sending to you on a regular basis. So I would encourage you to check that out at the website. But of course, if you want to give us a call, the order line is a little different number, 800-347-5151, 1-800-347-5151. Have a lot more to cover. We'll be back right after this.
When you support Point of View, you are joining a coalition of listeners around the nation who are passionate about restoring America's godly heritage, re-anchoring her in biblical truth. There is no better time to support Point of View than right now. The days of 2025, they are dwindling down, and so are the matching funds available to you. When you give by December 31st, your gift will be doubled, 2 times the impact. But that time is running out, and your support of Point of View is critical to ensure that Americans everywhere have access to biblically based resources on air, online, and in print. Do not wait. Join the movement, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. Give by December 31st to have your gift doubled. Give at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just wanted to tell you, too, how much I have appreciated Point of View over the years. I've always been taught that we take care of our own, and I feel like Point of View is one of our own because of the Christian worldview that you do promote. And so I have become a partner today, and I just want to thank you so much, and just God bless you for all that you do.
Listen, I wanted to make a quick comment. I'm a relatively new listener to the show, and I really kind of stumbled upon it more than anything because I'm doing some driving now that I wasn't in the past. And my comment really is, I think you guys and gals are more right on about the assessment of this country right now than anything I've heard. You know, I go home and I tell my wife, you've got to hear what they're talking about on the show. It's just so right on. And I tell my parents the same thing.
I'm 25 years old, and I started listening to Point of View about 4 years ago, and it has changed the way that I think and the way that I view the world around me.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, and again, if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen to some of the conversation around the table. Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor, and I thought, Dr. Matthews, we might for a minute mention that you gave us a pretty good list of what it means to be a principled conservative, but interestingly enough, we're going to be this hour talking about two other issues you could put on the table, but they weren't even ones you needed to mention because they sort of seem intuitively obvious, and one of those is free speech. Mm-hmm. There has always been the assumption, whether you are a liberal or a Democrat, to believe in free speech. And as you well know, before I did this talk show, sometimes I spent time speaking on college campuses, and being introduced by a professor sometimes in a major university would say, well, we have Mr. Anderson here. He's part of this Christian Update Forum, and I'm a liberal, and you know my view, and yet I think just out of fairness, you might want to hear a different point of view. And I was introduced that way even by liberals who said your views are at least worthy of consideration. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm going to critique them pretty hard, and it was pretty bloody sometimes in the classroom, but that was the case. No longer, because now, especially on the left, there are certain ideas that just aren't even allowed to be considered. And this next article by James Freeman just reminds us, if you think it's bad in the United States, it's gotten out of hand there in Europe.
Right. And you and I remember back in the 60s and 70s when the support for free speech tended to be a liberal idea. There were major liberals in the country that really promoted that. But for the last 20 years or so, that has shifted so dramatically that a lot of people who were major liberals in the 60s and 70s have now, they sound more like conservatives and they're criticizing liberals and their willingness to stop free speech, and we've seen this on campuses in so many cases. A Federalist Society speaker goes to speak on something. Usually the Federalist Society likes to have a pro and a con, so whatever the issue is, they have somebody there taking both sides. But a lot of these have been shut down by people, students who come in and they just refuse to listen to what the conservatives said, even creating safe rooms so that they could go and not hear something from a conservative. And I remember going back and just there have been people who came when I was at UTD as a PhD student. I didn't agree with them on stuff, but they were coming to speak, so you would go and listen to them, see what they said. You might ask questions, but that's how you learned what their points were, so that even if you disagreed, I understand now where you're coming from, so I can make a stronger point against you. If you never hear them, you don't know what they're thinking.
Again, I remember the book, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, yes, and others that were talking about that. But Liberty, your thoughts, because again, I know that is an issue you've addressed many times on the Know Why podcast.
Yeah, I mean, and a few other books, The Vanishing American Adult, again, by Senator Ben Sass, The Coddling of the American Mind, this idea that speech itself is violence. And if you start buying into that, then you will fight against certain speech. You will refuse to listen to certain speech because you believe that you or somebody else is physically being hurt by that speech. And as crazy as that is to say and sounds to us, that is really the idea that has governed a lot of people. And so, yeah, I mean, I remember at my college campus, Patrick Henry College, every semester, all classes were canceled. You were going to a Faith and Reason lecture, and a lot of times they would specifically pick out people who maybe had some controversial ideas, and everybody would get a printed copy of the lecture so they could take notes and write arguments during the lecture. And then we would break out into small groups, come up with a question, wrestle, come back, reconvene, ask the speaker, and people would end up debating about it online for weeks after or in the cafeteria. But I realize now why they did that, because they wanted to teach us how to listen to ideas that we might disagree with and then be able to critique that and talk about that in a community. And that is just such an important process for any sort of young person, for any American. If you're going to live in a free nation with free speech, you have to be willing to listen to other ideas, and then that makes your own ideas stronger if you'll actually sit through that argument and then redevelop your own argument again. And I think that's what a lot of young people are missing today.
You mentioned the book, The Colony of the American Mind. We had Jonathan Haidt on this program. Now, he's a liberal, a secular liberal, by the way, although his co-author is a Christian and who's been on with us as well. And we had him on long before sometimes even some of the liberal media outlets had him on, because they were arguing that something's happening on campus where there's this emphasis on safetyism. We have to have safe spaces. We have to have trigger warnings. And young people are melting down because they're hearing something that they don't agree with. And that's part of the educational process, isn't it?
It absolutely is. When I taught philosophy, one of the things we would do is I'd come in one class, and I'd have the people who believe in God get on one side of the room, the people who didn't on the other side of the room, and they had to debate the issue. Then the next time we came, they had to switch positions.
Right.
So you had, if you may have believed in God, but you had to take the position that you didn't believe in God, because it forced you to go and look at the arguments and try to figure out, how do I make a good case for this? And it just opened your mind up to understand what the other side says in many cases, so that you can be better defend your own position. It just forces people, and this is, I think the debate stuff is still going on in the country, but that's so good, because you go to one of the debate issues and you may not know what side you're supposed to be taking until the last minute, and you've got to take a position and defend that, and it forces you to think through these things and try to figure out good arguments and find holes in the other person's argument.
And you mentioned that idea of taking the other person's viewpoint. Jonathan Haidt, if I could mention another one of his books, both of which are around the table here, and that is The Righteous Mind, because they did some studies and they found, no surprise, that liberals don't understand conservatives as well as conservatives understand liberals. Now, I discovered that years ago. I found that evolutionists didn't understand creation as well as creation understand evolution. I found that atheists don't understand Christians as well as Christians understand atheists. And part of that is that a lot of people are in their silos. Now, some of the callers we had the first hour sound to me like they weren't necessarily agreeing with everything around the table. They were willing to listen, but they're the exception. It is quite possible for an individual living in some of these very significant, if you will, silos, to only talk to people that they agree with, only necessarily bring people to their Christmas dinner table who they agree with. And there's, if you will, a fairly significant amount on both sides, but they found with empirical evidence that conservatives have to live in the world of liberals because of media and things like that. So they have a better understanding of the liberal point of view. The liberals have a very jaundiced and maybe incomplete understanding of the conservative point of view.
Yeah, again, that illustrates why it's so important to broaden your perspective, because I think people are surprised when it's a lot easier to attack a straw man, to attack something that's not real and just an idea or a caricature or a stereotype. But when you get in there and you're willing to listen, like I applaud these listeners who called in, to different kinds of ideas, or have a conversation with somebody that holds the opposite viewpoint, it really does help you understand them better, and again, help reinforce or challenge your own beliefs and make them stronger.
Again, this article is called The Blessing of Free Speech. I may post it again next week, because we have Lathan Watts with us, and with the Alliance Defending Freedom, they've been looking at what is happening right now with the various EU regulations, in which they were saying we can't even allow you to have Elon Musk do an interview with Donald Trump on X, because that would violate our principles. So this is where free speech came from in Europe, and now they're seemingly turning their back on it. So we'll talk about that again. We'll be back with other issues right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, the carol, O Come, Emmanuel, is an English translation of a Latin hymn that was sung during Advent and Christmas. The text goes back to at least the 18th century and perhaps much earlier, while the music goes back to the 15th century. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Emmanuel means God with us. Even before the coming of Christ, we see passages in the Old Testament that remind us that God was with Israel. In 1 Kings 8, we read, Praise the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the wonderful promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our ancestors. May he never leave us or abandon us. In Psalm 46, we read that the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. One of the most visible reminders of God's presence was during the Exodus. God was with the Israelites as a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of smoke by day. His presence was with them in the tabernacle and later in the temple in the Holy of Holies. But the most important aspect of Emmanuel is found in the New Testament. John tells us in his gospel, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This is the miracle of the incarnation. God put on human flesh and came to Israel so that he might give his life for all of us. Paul writes to Timothy, Here is the great mystery of our religion. Christ came as a human. This is what we celebrate at Christmas. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. You might be saying, well, you spent a lot of time talking about Republicans and conservatism. What about this? And this is an article that actually comes from the Liberal Patriot. Probably not something most of you read every day, but I'm always looking for any good article. And this one is talking about the demise of religion among Democrats. Now, John Halpern is an individual that is a Democrat, as far as we can determine. He's certainly lamenting the fact that whereas before there was, if you will, a bigger tent, the growing secularism within the Democratic Party has been well identified. And so he points out that you have, of course, two different groups. On one side, you have the so-called post-industrial metro centers, and that's the Bay Area, Atlanta, Austin, Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, New York, Seattle. But then you have this other side of the divide, small towns and mid-cities. But the bigger divide is simply this. And this chart, if you'd like to see it, shows the remarkable movement of people who identify as Christian, other Christian, Catholic, Protestant, all the different kind, Protestant, Catholic, whatever, and how that has moved dramatically. But a good way to illustrate that is we oftentimes talk about the people that are religiously unaffiliated, called the nuns. Why are they called the nuns? Because when they fill out a form with Pew or a variety of others, they will say none of the above. I don't believe in God, don't believe in church, and a variety of others. Well, the number of nuns have more than doubled in the Democratic Party compared to the population at large. And so there's this whole discussion, Liberty, of what is today called The God Gap. And again, I would encourage people to find it because it's got charts and graphs and all sorts of things which illustrate what we've noticed, and that is the party of God has always sort of been a little bit the Republican Party, but it's become by default even more because even using God talk or religious ideas in some of the party platforms has almost vanished from the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and, it's interesting, too. You are seeing, as we've talked about, more and more young people, members of Gen Z, actually returning to church, returning to religion, a surge in Bible sales. And I listened to a lot of young voices and liberal voices on this, and they acknowledge the fact that the world is so chaotic, especially the world that Gen Z grew up in. And something that I've talked about on the Know Why podcast is that the biblical worldview provides order and structure. And that is something that so many young people, especially if they were raised in more, liberal families or Democratic voting families, that they've often lacked. And so I think you're seeing it's interesting. The younger you are in Gen Z, the more likely you are to be expressing interest in religion. So, and also you can look at when it started to get more divisive and hateful, as we were talking about in the last hour. It's when religious affiliation started to go down. And that's gone down a lot more on the Democratic side, obviously, as we're talking about. So it's interesting. I do have hope, though, that the younger generation is starting to recognize the pitfalls of this, and they're seeking something better.
I think it was a couple of presidential elections ago where, as I recall, some Democrats were trying to get the word God into their Democratic platform.
Yes.
And it was voted down, if I recall correctly.
Mm-hmm. I was. Yeah.
It was an amazing thing watching this. And people sometimes now sort of equate the Republican Party with Christian conservatives, and Christian conservatives have made a much larger, they've grown significantly within the Republican Party. But it's just interesting how the parties are becoming increasingly aligned with a religion or no religion. And Democrats have Jews have typically been Democratic.
Yes.
I think we're seeing some shift over from that based upon the way Democrats responded in the past 4 years to some of the anti-Semitism going on in the U.S.
And we will talk about that in a minute, but I thought John Halpern says, okay, this is a problem for Democrats, for us Democrats, is how he's writing that. Since more than 2/3 of U.S. voters overall remain Christian, and that's Christian in the broadest sense of the word. Okay, we understand that. The increasingly non-Christian and secular Democratic Party remains out of touch with a huge chunk of Americans. He says, look, no one can make Democrats more religious. Got that right. But Democratic leaders and voters could certainly be more welcoming of the faithful and more accepting of their different cultural and social views, because he takes on how certainly there is a religious divide on everything from, abortion, gender issues, immigration, on and on and on, the role of government. And in some respects, you can see that if you want to continue to be sort of a minority party, and it used to be the Democratic Party was the majority party, but if you want to move towards being a minority party, keep turning your back on religion and God at a time when most Americans still believe that those are important parts of their life.
In the last election, Kamala Harris created a website, Evangelicals for Kamala Harris, which it just seems, because of the way things are moving, it just seems so odd to see that. And when they quoted her in there, it wasn't anything that, she just, I think she claims to be a Christian, but there was nothing in there that sort of sounded like she understood it. She just said she really appreciated the notion that we should help our fellow men, and that was sort of her basis for that. It's a real problem for Democrats right now, especially if the country becomes more religious.
One thing I might just mention real quickly, because we see this in the state of Texas, because Texans tend to be more religious. You have Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico, two individuals really trying to talk about the fact that really, I believe the Bible teaches the Democratic platform. It's a tough sell, especially when we get to the issue of abortion, as certainly one thing that Liberty can speak to. But, and it's been interesting to see how, in some respects, they're almost straining some of the scriptures to come to some of these conclusions. But if you're going to, as James Tallarico is going to run for Senate, and I guess Jasmine Crockett is, and a number of others, wish them well, you've got to come up with something if you're going to appeal to anyone other than your secular Democratic base, right?
Yeah, and I think people see through that. You mean, you see, once a politician becomes more prominent or they run for president, and they will pay lip service, they'll visit the round of churches that they think are likely to support them, or their congregants will support them. But I think people can see through that and see when it's really kind of fake, because I think one of the things that explains Donald Trump's election the first time is that a lot of just working class, normal Americans, even those who had traditionally voted Democrat, still had overall traditional values. And that didn't mean that they were bigoted or that they, hated people with different lifestyles, but they still held to that. And they were told that they were hateful and they were discriminated against, as we talk about with our friends from First Liberty Institute. And so I think people were tired of that. And so Democrats, as we talked about, the progressive party within the Democratic Party really started to dictate a lot more of their messaging. And I think that alienated a lot of people that were just like, hey, what's wrong with what I've, believed in the church that I've gone to my entire life?
For decades, liberal Christian pastors oftentimes were supportive of Democratic candidates, would have Democratic candidates in. One of the things we've seen over the last 10 years or so is Republican pastors, Republican ministers being much more vocal about people that they support in the political realm. And that's probably making it harder for some of the Democrats, because the Republicans the ministers are saying, we think you ought to be voting for this person or in this direction as a Republican.
One other point I thought I'd bring together, we talked about free speech. How about freedom of religion? It does seem to me that there are some in the Democratic Party, and of course some we'll get back to in the Republican Party, that aren't real big on free speech. But this whole issue of freedom of religion, we've had Kelly Shackelford here, and he's talked about the fact that they put together a Religious Liberty Commission that has met on multiple occasions. And many of the challenges, many of the attacks on religion have come from the blue states and have come from very significant and prominent leaders in the Democratic Party. And that's why John Halpern wrote about the demise of religion among Democrats, because he's saying to his fellow Democrats, if we don't open up the tent, if we don't stop criticizing religion, we really will be a minority party in the future.
It's been an interesting change, because the restriction on free speech and the restriction on religious liberty are sort of moving hand in hand on the liberal party side. And so that's going to alienate an awful lot of people.
Well, we're going to need to take a break. And I'll mention again, if you haven't responded to the opportunity to actually have your dollar contribution doubled, that is the case. We started the program at $119,000. I'll give you an update on Monday because it's getting pretty late, but we'll tell you where we are there. I want to make sure that you take advantage of the match money that's on the table. Still a fair amount that is there, but you just never know how many people respond Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But once we get back here on Monday, by the way, I'm going to have Penna Dexter in studio. We have not seen Penna in a long time, so that will be kind of fun to have her here. And of course, I mentioned a few others will be with us. Gary Bauer's going to be with us, and we're going to be talking with Lathan Watts and a variety of others. But let's take a break. This is a great time to visit the website, pointofview.net. We've been talking about anti-Semitism. We'll get to that right after these important messages.
When you support Point of View, you are joining a coalition of listeners around the nation who are passionate about restoring America's godly heritage, re-anchoring her in biblical truth. There is no better time to support Point of View than right now. The days of 2025, they are dwindling down, and so are the matching funds available to you. When you give by December 31st, your gift will be doubled, 2 times the impact. But that time is running out, and your support of Point of View is critical to ensure that Americans everywhere have access to biblically based resources on air, online, and in print. Do not wait. Join the movement, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. Give by December 31st to have your gift doubled. Give at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-333-3776. 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews, Liberty McArtor with us. And Dr. Matthews, we're talking about some of the principles for a conservative. Another one is free speech. Another one is, well, we treat everybody, whether Jew, Christian, or atheist, with respect. But that has not necessarily been the case. So this article is one by Victor Davis Hanson, Slouching Towards Open Season on Jews, reminding us, of course, Jews celebrating Hanukkah were slaughtered by a Muslim father and son, almost an imitation of the October 7 massacres. In Europe, canceling Christmas celebrations out of fear of threats of violence from Muslim minorities, which I think just illustrates, again, we have a problem in this country, but it's even worse in Europe. And then he goes through and just reminds us of the fact that this has changed dramatically. 5 years ago, one of the booklets I put out was on anti-Semitism, but about 2 years ago, I said, well, I need to do an update because of critical theory, you have more and more young people marching in the streets supporting Hamas over Israel because, well, Israel is the aggressor and Hamas is the one that is being oppressed. And again, there's just so many, if you will, linguistic contortions being used right now when people marching in the streets say from the river to the sea. Sometimes they can't even tell you what the river is or the sea is. And this has been the problem. And in some respects, we'll first focus on Democrats. But now, as he spends some time talking about, this is a problem in the Republican Party, too.
And let's not forget that the Europeans have a long-running music contest that several of the countries decided they would not participate this year because of the Jewish people being able to participate in it. So it has gotten, and this is the strangest thing to me. I mean, in most cases, if you see a Jew on the street, I've worked with Jews that I didn't know were Jews until I found out later on that they were. Why you pick them out, is a mystery to me, because they've made good Americans since the founding of the country. They are oppressed people. They're our greatest friends in the Middle East there, and they're the only real democracy there in the Middle East. And the notion that you have, and they're the only really calming element in there. I mean, it's stable element. So I'm mystified by this anti-Semitism that's around.
Liberty, sometimes I just say the only way it makes sense is spiritually. That Satan hates God's people, whether it's Christians or Jews, and Muslims hate, the Saturday people and the Sunday people, because it makes no sense logically to see this little small country that is about the size of New Jersey surrounded by these massive other Muslim countries, or to even recognize that, well, we have about 6 million Jews in this country, about 6 million in Israel, about 6 million in the diaspora. Now that number is a little bit larger. And to say that all the problems in the world are due to this very small religion only makes sense if you recognize it's really a spiritual battle.
It is. And it's a age-old conspiracy theory, one that has been debunked many times over thousands of years. And, it's discouraging to hear popular, podcasters in the podcast sphere, which, millions and millions of people listen to these. This is where a majority of people, especially in my generation, are getting their news anymore. Not from even mainstream news. Gen Z, liberal or conservatives, they tend not to trust the institutions. So they're listening to podcasts. And what's interesting is a lot of them on polls will say they don't agree with the anti-Semitic things that the hosts like Nick Fuentes may be saying, but they just kind of shrug at it like, I don't really agree. But it's just become normal for people to talk about this and advocate these very anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so I do think it's a spiritual battle. And I think it's, again, an example where education is needed. Another example that I saw was a great interview the Free Press did with somebody who used to be a pro-Palestine activist on a college campus. And she said, she was just told over and over again by the people in her group not to ask questions. She didn't even know what had happened on October 7th. She was actually invited on a paid trip to go to Israel. And only then did she get the full truth of what had really happened. But she said if you even challenged any sort of the narrative or questioned, what river, what sea again? Don't ask those questions, because now you're on the side of the oppressor. And so it really, you have to strive to get educated about things today. And I think a lot of people don't even realize how miseducated they are.
And, since we're talking to a Christian audience primarily, there are Christians out there, including Candace Owens, who claims to be a Christian. Tucker Carlson claims to be a Christian, who are have become some of the biggest sponsors of anti-Semitism, especially with Candace Owens. I mean, it's bizarre that she came up and said maybe the Mossad was instrumental in killing Charlie Kirk. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you sit there and think, wow,
where did that
Charlie
come from?
Kirk was a major supporter of Israel. Well, it's because I was showing him some of the reasons why, some of the problems with Israel, and he was beginning to change his mind, she said. I don't know where this is coming from, but it is bizarre.
And again, we have tried to give some education. Sometimes we wonder how to do that, and I know that you've covered that and the Know Why podcast, which we're going to talk about in just a minute as well. But we have a booklet actually 2 booklets on anti-Semitism, but the most recent one kind of takes on some of those issues. We have a booklet on Israel and a preview of coming attractions. We have one on Christian Zionism, because we felt that was an issue as well, in which we talk about Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Nick Fuentes, to mention just a few. But again, you don't have to necessarily support this ministry, but if you do, that's one of the benefits, because that one is coming out shortly, and it would be one of the benefits you would receive if you supported this ministry. But this article goes on for 5 pages, if nothing else, Liberty, just reminding us that this is something that has been a primary issue among liberals, but you are seeing some people calling themselves conservatives, which is why Dr. Merrill Matthews talks about what's a principled conservatism, because these are people that take the mantle on, and that is, I think, really devastating to what I think is a very important policy procedure that we might use. Because if you think about it, the first Gentile ambassador to Israel is what? Mike Huckabee. And couldn't have a person more supportive of the nation of Israel and Jewish people. And that's always been our argument to our Jewish friends. Sometimes we say, I know you're voting Democratic, but the bottom line is, if you really want to have people that love you, evangelical Christians are the ones who do indeed love the Jewish people, because of the history of the Bible and also the history of those who have always stood for those individuals, whether Jews in this country or Jews in Israel. We've really stood for them.
Oh, absolutely. I think this is one big part of kind of the civil war, so to speak, that we're seeing between the Heritage Foundation and people leaving for Americans Advancing Freedom, Mike Pence's organization. Obviously, there were other issues. There had been kind of a turn in policy focus at the Heritage Foundation, but I think the straw that broke the camel's back was this rise in anti-Semitism. Tucker Carlson hosting Nick Fuentes, the president on his podcast, not criticizing him or pushing back. The president of the Heritage Foundation posting a video defending Tucker Carlson. It was unnecessary. And so I really think that this is where a lot of the division within the conservative movement is coming from. And so again, back to those principles, what's the old saying? If you don't stand for anything, don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. Yeah. So if you're not standing for your principles, then you really are just kind of riding the wave of what's popular. And I think that that's what we're starting to see, instead of people defending those principles that conservatives have stood by.
Which is why Victor Davis Hanson says the right has an anti-Semite problem, because we're just seeing some of the rise. It used to be sort of relegated to the Klan or something like that, Oath Keepers or something, but it has begun to expand into people who are considered to be major speakers of the right.
I think it is fair to say, and see if you disagree, that the left is fearful of really trying to police what's going on in the Democratic Party. I think with the fact we're talking about it, and many others are willing to speak out of what has happened in the Republican Party, are encouraging, and some people like Senator Ted Cruz and a variety of others have been speaking out with some force, and that I think is certainly a very helpful idea, because if you want to see what it looks like if you don't speak out, just look at what's happening in the Democratic Party. So again, we'll take a break and we'll come back, and wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking with Liberty about her Know Why podcast, because we have a link to her best of 2025. Now, I hope that you're on a regular basis subscribing to that, but if you find yourself saying, well, I didn't know much about it, she's picked out some of the best, some on biblical reliability, one on AI, which, by the way, is the upcoming issue in Outlook, another reason to support Point of View, and also on Charlie Kirk, traditional wives, and a variety of others. So we'll talk about that with her. And of course, as I mentioned, Penna Dexter will be with us on Monday, but we also have her commentary today on gender relations rewired. So all of that is available at the website at pointofview.net. As you go there, hope you'll also click on the button that says Give Now, because we are certainly encouraging you to support this ministry and other ministries, including your church and the radio station that carries this program during year end. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
New research on the gender divide shows that young men want marriage and family more than young women do. The Daily Signal reports that as recently as 1993, 83% of 12th grade girls told researchers they were likely to get married, while only 76% of boys that age thought they would tie the knot. Two recent surveys reveal that the status quo has flipped. A November Pew Research study shows 74% of 12th grade boys say they'll marry. Just 6 in 10 girls say they will do so. In September, NBC News asked 18 to 29-year-olds what factors they see as necessary for a successful life. Men rank getting married and having children higher than their female peers. The Daily Signal's Katrina Trinko detects a true values shift where women no longer see marriage and children as key to fulfilling life. Political science Samuel Abrams and demographer Joel Kotkin analyzed the data on this phenomenon. In an article for Real Clear Investigations, they conclude that men and women increasingly inhabit separate psychological, relational, and civic universes that interpret adulthood, authority, intimacy, and obligation in profoundly different ways. They point to the steady decline of marriage and childbearing as a visible and devastating sign of this divide. Its result has been the disruption of the traditional paradigm, which emphasized family and community. They lament what they call a post-familial ethos. This change has been building since the 70s, the me decade. One factor is technology, which has made us more isolated from one another. Identity is derived less from ties to family. Instead, the self is primary. Dr. Abrams and Kotkin unpack this rewiring in detail. A key observation is that commitment now competes with autonomy, and autonomy often wins. This important article suggests creating a new family ethic, emphasizing ways to reinvigorate marriage and family formation. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes since we have Liberty in here. I thought we would spend some time talking about her Know Why podcast. It's knowwhypodcast.com. Really easy to find, but also we have a link there. And what I've done is link to your best of 2025. You have a little video there that you can watch if you want. It's got 24 minutes worth, so you can get a sense of the podcast, or you can find some of those podcasts there. But Liberty, just talk about that, because I think we're coming up the second year, aren't we, for that?
Yeah, so, I really want to help young adults know why they believe what they believe, hence the name. And so we cover all kinds of topics, everything from religious topics and spiritual topics to what's going on in the culture. And what I love about the best of episode, and it kind of works out like this every year, is that it tends to be a really good representation of the diversity of topics that I have covered within a year on the podcast. So every series that I've done in 2025 happens to be represented, and I choose these by the most popular. So among the top 5 most popular, it represents all the topics we've covered in 2025. And so that first one, biblical reliability, that was part of the Know Why God is Good series that we did, because that's one of the top questions Gen Z is asking. Not really whether they should believe in God, but is God good? Mm-hmm. So I had so many great guests as a part of that series, but they were pointing to examples in Scripture. Mm-hmm. But if you don't think you can trust Scripture, then those examples are kind of meaningless. And so Josh Barnes, who's frequently on the Millennial Roundtable or the Next Generation Roundtable, he joined the podcast to talk about authenticity, transmission, and accuracy. So it was just so educational to help people understand how special the Bible is in terms of the evidence for its accuracy. Of course, we had to talk about AI, artificial intelligence. So we did a whole series helping people understand that, specifically how should Christians think about it, and the very practical effects on school, on work, on your family. The real, people can talk about AI in the stock market and all that, but how's it actually affecting people's lives, and how do we react to it? So that's what we covered. And then we did a series on family formation, because we know fertility rates are falling, but also, as Penna Dexter's commentary points out, a lot of young adults, especially young men, they want a family. Mm-hmm. So everything from tackling marriage myths, we pulled a lot from Dr. Brad Wilcox's book, Get Married, and then some other kind of fun topics too, like, trad wife versus trans, and really how those are flip sides of the same coin, where people are not really understanding what masculinity and femininity mean, and they're trying to just kind of understand those and apply that to their life, and often focus more on the aesthetics and the true meaning. And so we get into some deep conversations, but I like to see what the audience listens to and what's the most popular, and that's what we highlight in the best of episode.
Dr. Matthews, you've been around long enough to remember back in the 1980s, we oftentimes at Point of View offered the best of Point of View. Mm-hmm. And those were in albums that had cassettes. I don't know if those young people even know what they are anymore.
I remember cassettes. I do.
And then eventually we put them on CDs. And of course, now you can actually just click on a button. And first of all, let me encourage everybody, if you've just got maybe 20 minutes, I think it's actually 24 minutes long, that's your good little best of right there. So you can actually watch the Know Why podcast, which is so well done. And of course, Liberty brings so much to the table. But I remember in the old days when we had the best of Point of View, we had these huge albums with cassettes or CDs or something like that. Now the technology's been a little bit better. And also you get to see her the whole time, because these are just really well done.
Well, vinyl is coming back. So I predict cassettes will come back at some point for some reason. Yes, we've done that for years, and because Point of View's been on since 1972.
Yes.
There has been so many things that we've covered over the years, and it's just there's always in a given time a lot of very, very good stories that we cover.
Well, again, I just think, Liberty, you've done such an outstanding job and brought so much to the table. Again, went to Patrick Henry College, which we just talked about a minute ago, learned how to think through these issues. And so, first of all, let me encourage people to consider what they might do to actually make that part of their podcast. I'm traveling around a fair amount, and I'm meeting more and more people that frankly don't even listen to the program live. They listen to the podcast, or they then scroll down, and there's a place where we have the Spotify podcast, which is a shorter version of some of those. And then you can go to, of course, your podcast and then the Apple podcast. So there's really 3 different podcasts. And in some respects, people say, well, when I support Point of View, I'm just supporting the radio program. I'm going, no, you're supporting that, plus all the videos, plus all the podcasts, plus all the booklets, all the books, all the other resources. There is a lot more to Point of View, and I think you've discovered that just in some of the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years.
Yes, if people, as we've heard a little bit today, if they appreciate the balance and the biblical perspective, and not just the angry talking or the saying the soundbite, but really getting into an issue to try to understand it. That's what Point of View has done done for decades. And that's what we're trying to do with the Know Why podcast as well. And so there are all kinds of ways for people to get that kind of content. I know, the Know Why podcast and the highlights of Point of View podcast, those tend to be a little bit shorter. So if you just have, a 20 or 30 minute chunk of time, it's a great way to still get informed and get educated. And of course, people can listen to the broadcast anytime online too. But there are so many ways that Point of View provides for people to listen and learn and get connected. And I appreciate that.
I love the Know Why concept because we many times promote the Mind Games Camp. And one of the things that they do every year at the Mind Games Camp, usually it's Dr. Ray Bolins, but in the old days it was Jerry Solomon, they would come in and would pretend to be a professor from North Texas who's an atheist and start asking questions of the students. And theoretically, most of the students in the room are Christian, but very quickly we could see that they knew what, but they didn't know why. So they would give the typical Christian cliche, and then he'd start asking second and third follow-up questions, and pretty soon all the students are looking at their shoes, didn't make eye contact because they didn't know why they believed. And so in some respects, people say, well, what's the concept of know why? That is, you need to know what, but you also need to know why. And that's why you get deeper into some of those issues, isn't it?
It is. And something that, I'm open about the fact that, hey, we're coming from a Christian biblical perspective here, but all listeners are welcome. Look at what the Bible teaches, and then there's so much data, so much research, topics in the news every day that point back to the Bible as being true. And it's just really neat to make that connection, and that's what we do on the podcast every week.
So again, if you go to the website, you can sign up for many of the podcasts, and I would encourage you to do that. I run into more and more people that say, I listen to the podcast of the program, or maybe even the highlights when I'm driving or when I'm jogging or walking or something like that. So those are resources. Penna Dexter's commentary, which we'll probably get into more detail on Monday since she'll be in studio. Gender Relations Rewired, just talking about the fact that this is an issue as well. New research on gender divide shows that young men want marriage and family more than young women do. So we're going to get into that. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to read that, you can go to the website right now and click on the button that says Gender Relations Rewired, and you will notice something else. There's a place where you can sign up to receive the podcasts, of course, but there's also a place where you can sign up to receive the commentaries, the Viewpoints commentaries. Mine arrive in your inbox Monday through Friday. Penna Dexter's, which we posted right now, will arrive on Saturday, and that's just one other resource that is available to you. First of all, Dr. Merrill Matthews, I'm going to see you next Friday, right? So,
Lord willing.
We will be together after the new year, so that is something we're looking forward to. Liberty, thank you for being here today, and thank you for what you are doing. 2 years and counting now for the Know Why podcast. So that is certainly the case. Let me just, before we say goodbye, recognize that even though we're going off the air, if you say, well, I'd like to make a donation, you can certainly go to the website, pointofview.net, or you can call this number, 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. We'll still answer your phone calls. Want to thank Megan and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Enjoy the weekend. See you back here on Monday on Point of View.
When you support Point of View, you are joining a coalition of listeners around the nation who are passionate about restoring America's godly heritage, re-anchoring her in biblical truth. There is no better time to support Point of View than right now. The days of 2025, they are dwindling down, and so are the matching funds available to you. When you give by December 31st, your gift will be doubled, 2 times the impact. But that time is running out, and your support of Point of View is critical to ensure that Americans everywhere have access to biblically based resources on air, online, and in print. Do not wait. Join the movement, Restoring America's Godly Heritage. Give by December 31st to have your gift doubled. Give at pointofview.net, or you can call us at 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.